So thank you, audience members, for joining us at the weirdest APSA ever. And given the APSAs of the past decade, I mean, like, I'm in DC, not very far from the hotel where they where it was almost burned down that one time at APSA, and then the following year there was the locust infestation. So like, APSAs haven't had the greatest luck, but this is definitely the weirdest, at least of my career. We've got a great panel today. I think this is one of the panels that if I was not a moderator, I would be showing up to listen. And I think there's a lot to talk about here. So without further ado, let me hand it over to David Campbell to talk with us about this broader democratic engagement project, AAAS's involvement in it, kind of what we're here to talk about today.
Sure, thanks, David. I was asked to give some remarks about the larger Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, which is the umbrella organization or entity under which the Democratic Engagement Project lives. Most everybody here is a member of this commission, although we do have, I think, a few audience members, so maybe not everybody's on the same page. So I will quickly recap what this commission is and then where this Democratic Engagement Project fits into it. But if any of the audience members have any questions about just what this is, feel free to pose them to me or to anyone else here because we can elaborate. But in general, the thing to know is that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences back in 2018 formed the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship out of a recognition that the nation is at a crucial moment in terms of the health of our democracy. And the idea behind the commission is that it would produce a series of recommendations to try to improve the state of American democracy by empowering voters, increasing civic participation, and just generally revitalizing our civic culture. It was led by Eric Liu, who is the president and CEO of Citizen University, Stephen Heinz, who is the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Danielle Allen, who, among many other things, is the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. I was actually given some notes by the commission staff. So what they wrote was that there are 35 of the country's foremost leaders in academia, civil society, politics, and business on the commission. I think what they meant to write is there are 34, and then somehow I ended up in the group. And I'm pretty sure that in my case, it was just a mistake, a stray invitation, and then they were just too nice to tell me not to come. So here I am. The idea behind the commission is that it represents many ideological views and people from lots of different backgrounds. And in addition to the commission members, the AAAS, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, they also went through this extraordinary effort to hold 50, you heard that right, 50 listening sessions around the country where they gathered people from many different walks of life just to hear from them. What did they think about the state of American democracy and civil society? And from that culled a lot of useful suggestions and ideas. And so the idea is that this is not just a bunch of elite people getting together and navel gazing, but instead actually engaging with the general public to just get a sense of what people out there think about American democracy and how it might be improved. You can read the report, which is available online. You can also get a hard copy. This is it here, called Our Common Purpose. It has a long list of recommendations. So it's not just a screed about what's wrong with America, but it's also some concrete recommendations over what can be done better. There are 31 of those recommendations. And the idea is that these will be implemented by 2026, which is the 250th anniversary of America's birth. But our purpose today is to talk about just one of those recommendations, which is officially known as Recommendation 5.5. But what that really means is a recommendation to create what is known, or will hopefully be known, as the Democratic Engagement Project. Just briefly, the idea behind this project is that it would be a way to monitor the democratic health of the United States. It would be an ongoing project, so not just a single shot thing. I actually wrote up a concept paper that some others have had some input in, and that's been circulated. It can be circulated even more widely, but nothing that has been discussed thus far is set in stone. One of our purposes today, I think, is to talk about what such a project might look like. I think there's general agreement that it would have a longitudinal component. It would involve some sort of national survey on a large scale, but that it might very well include other sources of data. This is an opportunity to collect data that maybe hasn't typically been used for this sort of thing and think creatively about how that might be done. And so I see one of our objectives today is to just bat around some ideas that might be fruitful for the implementation of this project, but maybe to go a little further than just brainstorm and actually talk about some concrete ways that this might actually come to pass. Because of course, the great challenge with something like this is that everybody thinks it's a great idea, but that it's always the second or third or fourth priority on somebody's to-do list and never at the top of their to-do list. And so somehow we need to figure out a way to overcome the usual collective action problem and see what can really be done concretely to move this forward. I won't say anything more about the project because I think we'll have some elaboration of that throughout the discussion. So I'll just pause there, but let me pass it back to our moderator and thank David Karpf, who is going to be leading us through this discussion. I should note that he, in addition to moderating today, has also written one of the white papers that the commission has published. So in addition to the report, there are some other white papers that have been produced. He's written one of them on the internet. It's entitled The Internet and Engaged Citizenship, and I commend that to all of you. It's a good read, and it's very relevant to, of course, the commission's recommendations. So I will stop there. As I said, if anybody in the audience has any questions or anybody on the commission wants to correct anything that I've said, by all means, we can do that. But if not, we'll pass it over to David and we can carry on with the discussion.
Great. So I want to note, if people who are not panelists have an urgent question, one that they don't want to wait, I think the last half hour is for Q&A. But if you have a question that comes up, if you can click the raise hand button in the participant side, I should hopefully see that, and then I can steer us to your question. In a normal panel setting, I view the moderator's role as basically setting things up and mostly getting out of the way. Zoom is a little different, but I still want to hold to those norms. So we have a number of excellent presenters here who have played a role in this, and I'd like to get each of your perspectives, just maybe 5 minutes on what you think the most important element of this project is. Why is it needed now? What's the hurdle it needs to overcome? So, you got 5 minutes, what's the thing you want to talk about? We can go in the order that's listed online, or if one of you would like to go first, you should raise your hand and start talking. Would anyone like to go first? So Lisa, you're listed first after David Campbell, so I'm then going to call on you.
Darn, I was really hoping somebody would want to go out of order. Thank you all for being here. I guess I'm going to be brief because I actually think the question and answer is probably the most important. I'd love to hear how what people are thinking about the report and what people think is most important. I guess for me, the key thing, and it's related to the project Dave laid out, is that this report makes really clear that we actually have to fix things in our democracy. I think there's a tendency to think, or the way we're taught is that, the founders are brilliant, the institutions are perfect, we should just leave them the way they are. And so it does have some institutional recommendations. The two, I think, that are especially important. The first is making Supreme Court justice terms 18 years instead of life appointments, which we think would have a lot of positive effect on just the dynamics around Supreme Court appointments. And then also the idea that the House of Representatives needs to be bigger, that we arbitrarily made it this size. And at least in a place like California, it means that our Congress people are representing more and more and more and more people and getting further and further away from the populace. But I think just that idea that we have to work on this, right? That our democracy is work and effort, that we have to think about institutional changes. And then I think the reason the Civic Engagement Project that Dave laid out is so important is that we actually have to work on bringing people into the polity in a proactive way rather than having this laissez-faire approach where people have to join should they feel like it. And I guess the last thing I'll say that's important about that research design is that the idea is that we would look longitudinally, because I think as social sciences, we're not very good at studying process. We're good at looking at snapshots in time, but not how people move through political space over the course of their lives, and how that changes depending upon their race, their gender, their class status, their contextual situation in terms of organization, geography, all of that. So I think there's a lot that we need to learn, but again, with that spirit that democracy is something you actually have to work at and not something that is a passive enterprise.
Thank you. Marie Griffith, you're next.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And I'll try to be brief as well. First, I just want to say what an honor it was to be selected for the commission. I feel somewhat like David does. But I learned so much from all of you I see here and everybody else that was on this commission. My participation, I'm a religion scholar. I'm not a political scientist. And I think I was brought in part to help think about the healthy civic culture dimension of what we were doing. A combination of values, norms, and narratives, which is a phrasing that you're going to see a number of times in the report. And so trying to think about the democratic engagement project piece of this, which we want to focus on now, this notion of values, norms, and narratives is sort of what's uppermost in my own mind. So I just wanted to start maybe with the narratives and just, these are sort of brainstorming ideas for our discussion, I hope, that may be helpful. So I'm particularly interested in how our narratives of US history influence our modes of democratic engagement. These are narratives that are obviously shaped by our own educational background, you know, whatever kinds of civics education we had or didn't have, the history books we read and so forth. And it's also influenced by religious participation, the media we consume and participate in, and much, much else, of course. And so how to get at those shaping narratives in this survey is really my question here for thinking about the democratic engagement project. So I was trying to brainstorm about this and thinking maybe the survey could ask some version of this. Which of the following comes closest to your view of US history and democracy? Is it that American democracy is hands down the greatest system in the world, the US is the best country in the world? Is it more, well, the US has never really fully realized our highest ideals, but we are progressing in the right direction and we'll continue getting closer to them? Is it democracy requires constant alertness and struggle against the powers that be, and we're never going to do any better unless we fight for everything we can get? Or is it more like the US was founded by violent slaveholders, crooks, and rapists, driven solely by selfish greed and love of power, and there's no saving it? This is a corrupt enterprise and good riddance. I mean, it seems to me that Americans hold very different narratives of the US, of our history and of our democracy. And I may not have worded these very well, but my first point for our discussion today is I'd really love the Democratic Engagement Project to get deeply at how these narratives have been shaped for people and what their impact is on, really on their belief in the ability to engage democracy. And then just two quick smaller points. As a scholar of religion, I'm particularly concerned about the effects of religious organizations and participation on democratic engagement. David Campbell, you and Robert Putnam got at this brilliantly in your tour de force, American Grace. So David, I know you have a lot of great ideas for how to think about getting these questions into the project. I think it's frankly important that we take off the kid gloves that we often wear around the topic of religion and religious belief and really analyze what types of religious organizations promote democratic engagement and what types stymie it or make people cynical about engaging their democracy. And I'm not just talking about churches and synagogues, but educational institutions like Liberty University or Jewish Theological Seminary or Howard Divinity School or Brigham Young University, and on and on and on. So I direct a research center on religion and politics in the US. And since we're at APSA, I just want to note that only a very small minority of political scientists actually study religion and religious organizations in depth, despite their enormous political impact. And so I think this project is a golden opportunity for deeper research and a lot more thorough analysis of religion and politics. And I'll stop there. I've got a couple more things to say, but I'll wait till later. Thank you.
Next up, Hahrie.
Thanks, Dave. I should echo what everyone else said, which is that it was super fun to be a part of the commission. It was fun to have an excuse to hang out with all the good folks on this Zoom and a lot of the other good folks on the call and on the commission. And I also felt very ill-equipped to be on it with this august group. So I feel like people have talked a lot about the commission already, and I very much share the sentiments that have already been shared about both its values and what it contributes to the broader conversation about democracy. And so I'll focus a little bit more on specifically on the Democratic Engagement Project and what I think is particularly useful about this potential data enterprise. And as I was thinking about it, there were three kind of like potentially useful, both practical and scholarly applications or downstream impacts from this. And so I thought I'll just sort of highlight three of those and put them on the table and see. I'm curious if other people agree or disagree or what they would add or take away from it. So first is kind of a John Kingdon type idea that like if you measure something, then it becomes a thing that people care about, and part of what I appreciated about being a part of the commission, which I think has been echoed in some of the comments that folks have already made, is the idea that it didn't necessarily think about democracy or the failures therein as being a function of like behavior and institutions, right, or just the mass public and the failure of our political institutions, but that it was an interlocking sort of three-way relationship between political behaviors and the mass public, the functioning of our institutions, but then also this kind of intermediary space that we call culture or norms or civil society or, the kind of softer areas that I think sometimes gets less attention. And to the point that Dave Campbell made, a lot of the times, I think sometimes like all the data that we have about civic life and civil society is very patchy. We don't necessarily have a very good comprehensive picture of how it looks across time and across space. And so the opportunity to measure that, I think, creates an opportunity to sort of shine a light on the importance of culture and norms and civil society and some of the more interstitial spaces that sometimes get lost in the conversation. Well, there's our favorite participant that we were hoping to see. Well done. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, sorry, next up is going to be Joseph Kahne, and also I need to go get my daughter a glass of milk while he talks. So I apologize for everybody, but yeah. Sorry, please continue.
So anyways, so I'll just sort of finish and then pass it on to Joe. But so the first thing I was gonna say is just like, I think that like simply by measuring something, you sort of shine a light on the importance of it. And I think there's value in that in and of itself, even as like a purely descriptive enterprise. The second point I wanted to make is I think one of the values that I see about this project is that when we think about things like civic culture or civil society, I feel like it's one of these situations where everyone has a piece of the elephant, but no one can see the whole elephant. And one of the challenges is that, in my mind, as we think about the need and the desire and the impetus to strengthen civil society, because no one can see the whole elephant, it's really hard to know how we can make strategic interventions. Because civil society is necessarily decentralized, and part of its strength comes from the fact that it is decentralized, how do we know where we're supposed to intervene to strengthen it? How do we know where the places are that we can do our part? And so having some sort of data source that would emerge in this Democratic Engagement Project that allows us to see the whole elephant, I think then enhances our capacity to exercise agency in reaching towards the kind of outcomes that we want. And the third thing that I would say is a slightly more substantive, I think, outcome of this, which is one of the things that we've talked about as we talked about the Democratic Engagement Project is that it's not just the survey data that would be the project, but the project would entail the opportunity to look at individuals nested within communities, right? So we would want to, using a lot of the kind of data and data tools that we have available now that we didn't necessarily have, half a century ago, is match the survey data to data about kind of organizations and things in communities. We're looking not only at what are the ways in which people are behaving and how do those behaviors and attitudes and affects kind of change over time and across space, but also what is the supply of opportunities that people have to get engaged in their communities? How are people invited to engage across difference? How are people invited to see themselves as agents in the political process? And I think right now, a lot of times we have survey data that sort of says, oh my gosh, you know, humans are ill-equipped for democracy, we're all doomed. But we don't have any data on, well, how is this sort of supply of opportunities that they're offered changed over time, and how does that look different now than it did 50 years ago, or so on and so forth. And so the extent to which we could begin to use this to kind of map people as nested within communities or different kind of contexts, I think allows us to not only begin to kind of see the whole elephant and measure things that we want to highlight as important, but also ask different kinds of questions that aren't necessarily being asked now. And so, you know, like mapping that organizational side of it is one of the things that I'm certainly most excited about, and some of the work that we've begun at Johns Hopkins in our little shop here. So, and welcome back, Dave. I'll pass it on to Joe anyway.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Hahrie. So hi, everybody, and similarly, really appreciate both the opportunity to be part of the commission, but also very much to be part of this discussion today. Like everybody, I'm super excited about some of the ways in which this new data could really strengthen our ability to understand and to act, you know, in an informed way to try to address some of the problems and challenges that I think, you know, folks are sort of constantly being confronted with right now, with the ways in which our democracy is operating. I think that there are a couple things that could make this effort particularly helpful in that regard. And I think very much as others were saying, and as I think Hahrie was speaking to the degree that we have data that can address specific kinds of things that will allow us to have certain kinds of conversations that are harder to have in a rigorous way if we don't. One thing that I think Dave mentions in his sort of write-up of this that's very important too, is that the field has, you know, obviously invested enormously in surveys, but there are ways in which surveys are just profoundly limited. And I think as we move into, we're already very capable of doing things now that would allow us to bring in much more authentic measures of things and to integrate them into the data set in a powerful way, which would allow us to line up surveys with measures of behavior as well as simulated things, all kinds of stuff one could do. And I think being creative around that would be exciting. The second sort of limit of data that I think we're frequently facing that I want to highlight, you know, is around different populations that, you know, frankly, especially when we're talking about longitudinal data sets, it's very expensive to have high quality longitudinal data sets that are also not only representative of the population as a whole, but allow us to talk about particular populations. You know, I do my work in education, and people talk, for example, a lot about the youth vote, you know, and you'll see this on the news. How you know, are youth going to turn out? As though youth are a group best understood as a generic category, when in fact, when we do have high quality data on varied populations, we find out that youth are actually incredibly diverse in terms of what they care about, how they behave, certainly what issues are most important to them. And so if you're not able to talk about particular populations, in many respects, you're not able to talk about what's actually going on. And so I think a data set like this that could have large enough populations of varied groups of young people and all people would allow us to be much more articulate about what's going on and about the impact of varied factors. Related to that, again, because I'm in education, I'm very excited that, you know, in the plans, our hope is to go younger than 18. I mean, again, if you're interested in politics, you've got to be interested in people before they're 18. And certainly today we see that in powerful ways, but both from a developmental standpoint, it matters a ton, and from as we live the individual day, it matters a ton. And there are, I think, really to a significant degree, you know, IRB requirements are why we often don't go younger than 18. I mean, it's more complicated if you've got to get parent or guardian permission. It's more expensive, and, you know, and then kids can't vote. And so some people wonder why ask what they think. But I think this kind of a data set that would commit to going with younger people would allow us to understand at minimum what's going on in high schools, what's going on in youth organizations, and what's going on developmentally, that would help us understand both youth's current involvement as well as their future involvement. And I'm super excited about that. So I'll pass it to Ethan, I think.
Sure. So let me continue the trend by not only saying that it's been great to be part of the commission and wonderful to be in this conversation, but I am the only genuine imposter here. I'm a tech guy who managed at some point to weasel my way into these conversations about democracy and political science and sort of all of that. So I'm actually going to try to get very concrete in sort of pushing us in some sort of directions about what data we might use in doing this. And this is going to build in some ways on research I've been doing this summer. I've been leading a small team that's been sort of asking this question of how do we interrogate these digital public spaces that we're getting both so good at using and also very concerned about using, whether that's Twitter, whether that's Facebook, whether that's YouTube. Eventually, we're going to start interrogating things like Zoom. What are the affordances of this? How does it shape our speech? There was a wave of excitement about doing quantitative research on these platforms around a project called Social Science One, where the Social Science Research Council was going to get together with Facebook and make data sets widely available. That project hit some real snags. And there's many people who are involved with it who are very frustrated about what data actually came out with it. Social Science One continues. There's a new wave of research planned around the 2020 US elections. There's now a call for pre-registration of experiments using that data. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there. I got asked to sort of take on this question of what else might be out there. Is the only way to study democracy in these digital public spaces by going sort of hat in hand to Facebook and saying, please, sir, can we have some data? And the good news is that no, of course, that's not the only way to do it. There's certainly the possibility of things like survey data that we're talking about here, but there may be some other really fascinating ways of generating data sets that can help us get to some of these fundamental questions of how these new digital public spaces are shaping democratic dialogue in one fashion or another. One is an idea that's being promoted in many ways out of the journalistic community. Julia Ongwen over at The Markup is one of the biggest advocates for creating panels of social media users who are opting into having their social media experience tracked, registered as a data set, and then with some level of differential privacy on it being released. There's another project coming out of Mozilla that would actually do data donation from within the Firefox browser. And similarly, what would happen here is if you were using Firefox, you might decide to let your interactions on Facebook or Twitter or wherever be registered as part of a data set, and then that data set could be accessible with certain privacy concerns associated with it. You can imagine there's a great methodological debate here. Do you want to create a representative panel and pay them? Do you want to take data donation from a much larger but less representative set of people? Sort of where do you go with that? There's also strategies that are going on regarding sort of auditing these platforms from the outside by running sets of queries on a regular basis, sharing the results. And then there's a group of people who are trying what I think in many ways is the most interesting experiment, which is, can you scrape all of the content off of these platforms? And I spoke with someone yesterday who has created an alternative system that is capable of essentially reproducing the Twitter fire hose without Twitter's permission. So there's this extraordinary range of people creating different ways to sort of approach this platform data. For me, the interesting question is, we've got a lot of public discussion right now about how information environments might be affecting democracy. We have hypotheses that tools like Facebook may be leading towards more political polarization, pushing people towards radicalization. You have journalists like Kevin Roos who are pushing a very compelling narrative that people are encountering digital public spaces and falling down rabbit holes. What we do not have at the moment is a good answer to the denominator problem. So the numerator is, hey, look, here's extremist content. Here is content designed to suck people into extremism. What we do not know, and in many ways cannot know, is how representative this is of all content on Facebook. Facebook is never going to give you the denominator because that is the secret at the heart of their business. How many people are actually seeing posts, how much engagement is actually happening. There's two ways you can solve for the denominator. One is you can just spider an entire platform. If we track everything on Twitter and then we track content from something like QAnon, we should be able to tell you whether that's 1% or 0.0001%. The other way is through panels. When we look at a wide range of people, are they encountering this really polarizing, really hateful content? Or frankly, are these public spaces actually a robust space for participatory democracy? And here, finally, I just want to tie it back to what Marie said. A lot of this comes out about narrative. Right now, when we're talking about democracy in digital spaces, the narrative is that Facebook is going to kill us all. And I think that narrative is not just a popular journalistic narrative. I see it actually affecting a lot of the quantitative and qualitative research that's actually being done in this space. And I'm just not sure that it's actually a valid narrative. And so one of the things that I would really love to see us do within this project is take seriously that denominator problem and try to figure out whether these extraordinary cases of terrible things happening online are indicative of what's actually happening in this space, or whether it's a much broader and more complex system on these online spaces.
So thank you to everybody for those opening remarks. That gave us a ton of, that gave me like 6 different ideas that I want to pursue. Maybe 2 of them in this panel, and then the other 4 just things that I want to write when I have time to write. One thing that comes up for me listening to all of you is there are a lot of the things that this democratic engagement project could be, and it probably can't be all of them. To what extent have we already figured out that one version of this that reading the concept paper seemed clear to me is that at core, like, we have some panels out there, we don't have a lot of them. Like the big panel data, we don't have a lot of them, and they tend to be old questions. So one model of this is we're gonna do a new gold standard like panel survey with questions that track civic engagement plus some other stuff. Is that the heart of this project, or are there other pieces that either would be displacing it, competing with it? Like, what is the heart of this project? Or do we know?
I mean, I'll jump in to say that from where I don't know, I mean, you know, my understanding is that it's still in development, you know, and in some ways the kind of virtue of having this conversation is an opportunity to have a broader discussion about what would be valuable, you know, about something like this. But I think the notion was that the commission felt like something like this was needed. And the hope is that as the recommendations are getting implemented, this would be the kind of thing that we could begin to develop. Okay. I don't know, others should chime in if their understanding is different. These decentralized efforts are always a little bit hard to know.
I mean, I'll jump in just to say, the way I imagined it is that, in fact, I think it would be best if it were a cohort of researchers who have different areas of focus. But what excites me is really what both Hahrie and Ethan were talking about. This wouldn't just be a survey, right? We have the opportunity now to situate people in political space, both virtual and physical, in ways that we didn't before, and to connect that to attitudinal data. So I would not want kind of a GSS, right? Like, I think it's really about how do we maximize what you can learn from a survey and then have all of this other information. If you imagine if you could connect surveys to vote, the voter file. So we see someone from pre-18 all the way forward and we know their actual vote behavior and what elections they're a part of. And I just think that there's a potential to have a layered and much more multifaceted understanding of how people move through political space over their life course, and the ways in which that ebbs and flows over time. And so that's what I find exciting about it.
And if I don't want to cut anybody off, I was going to chime in. So to answer David's specific question, I think this is consistent with what we've heard already. I mean, I do think that a survey is at the core of this, but it's a survey plus the other things that have been described. And importantly, whatever else it would be added on, whether it's social media usage, which I definitely think should be part of it, or the sort of layering that Lisa was describing, or the organizational data that Hahrie was describing earlier. I think all of that should be a part of this, and it should be a part of it from the beginning. And that doesn't mean that whatever is decided at one point in time is then frozen and can never change. But I do think that one of the problems with existing surveys is they are fundamentally surveys. They're individual level data. And then anything else that's done is sort of post hoc. Like, can we figure out how to merge in data because now we have some geographic identifier that's not quite what we need, but it's close enough. And I've done a lot of that in my own career, and I can tell you how frustrating it is because you can never quite map the individual onto the right community level because it wasn't designed to do that in the first place. And a lot of people have done some very creative work with that kind of post hoc stuff. So imagine what people could do if we had a study that was designed from the very beginning to do the things that had been described here. Now, in saying that, we also need to be conscious that somebody's got to pay the bills. So it's not like we can just imagine doing whatever comes to mind. There does have to be some boundaries on what's feasible. But I think everything that has been described thus far actually is well within the realm of what strikes me as feasible. Not cheap, but also not so expensive that it couldn't possibly be done.
Other reactions?
I had the great joy some years ago working with Joe Kahne and Kathy Cohen on a really terrific survey on youth political participation, which tried, amongst other things, it tried very hard to get an extremely diverse sample set by oversampling youth of color. But I think what it did, perhaps more than anything else, was accept that a lot of our definitions of democratic participation are way too narrow, and that we really need to expand quite radically what constitutes civic engagement, civic involvement in one fashion or another. I'm gonna argue that moderating online communities in many ways is one of the more civic things that people could end up doing. You don't necessarily have to discuss Trump versus Biden for it to be civic. It might be simply about learning how to govern a space that you care about. And so I think I'm a big fan of using survey research to complement other forms of data acquisition. Obviously, I'm really obsessed with these questions of how do we study some of the places in which civics is currently unfolding, and can we combine that with survey data? But I think, David, this idea of sort of starting at the very beginning, I think before we even ask questions about what it is we want to track, we have to start by asking those questions of what civic engagement looks like right now, and what are signals of that engagement, and how do they differ from instruments like the GSS and others where we've looked at sort of more traditional forms of participation. And again, maybe this gets back towards narratives. If we understand civic engagement through a fairly simple narrative of voting, putting up lawn signs, et cetera, we value certain things in a survey instrument, whereas if we take a very different and much broader narrative to what engagement looks like, we might end up designing very different ways of collecting information.
So let me tangle with that a little bit, because I think that's right, but it also raises for me that I think it is easy to treat civic engagement and democratic health as though they are synonyms. And particularly actually from some of your recent work, like QAnon followers are deeply civically engaged. QAnon is bad for the health of American democracy. Another example that was coming to mind for me recently, Hahrie mentioned the questions of who get like the supply side, who gets invited to participate. And one thing I've been pondering recently is that I don't think I personally would go to a protest right now in 2020. I have a deep activist background. I'm the type of person who would be invited to go to a protest. But I have repeatedly seen in the news that people who turn out to protests now get hit by cars. Now, the person at a survey data level, the person driving the car has attended a protest. They are civically engaged. They are also engaged in violence against protesters, where like the likelihood, at least the numerator of ending up dead because you showed up to a protest to use your civic voice, like that's on the rise in the past few years. And I think that's a thing that I don't know how to square that, particularly with our traditional methods. But certainly coming up as a political scientist, I had a baseline assumption that civic engagement is good regardless of your political perspective. We would like more of it. I think that's kind of baked into all of political science and therefore also baked in for the commission. And it's also something that seems a bit divorced from at least the headlines of 2019 and 2020, where now an awful lot of what we would say on paper looks good because it's civic engagement, it's participation, is also, like white nationalists showing up to a rally in Charlottesville. That's bad for our democratic health, even if it's civic engagement. And so I don't quite know how to handle that in data collection, but I want to pose it to panelists at least as a problem, because I think if we're tracking the normal variables and adding on variables like, okay, are you moderating on online community? That, like, I agree with you, of course, that's civic engagement. And also, depending on the online community, it's deeply bad for democratic health in a way that I don't think I'm being particularly partisan in saying that.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just follow up on that. I mean, I think that's a really helpful thing to bring into the discussion. And one of the things that I cut myself off and didn't say had to do with the values that the commission stressed over and over again. So this is a very inchoate thing, right? And it's not part of our usual social scientist talk, but we spent a great deal of time, especially one of the working groups that I was in, devoted to thinking about the values necessary for a healthy democracy. And this is one way I think of thinking about this distinction that you're drawing there. Truthfulness and empathy and inclusiveness and service to others, this on and on. And we had a lot of debate about these, obviously, and how you talk about them. But they come out throughout the report in, I think, some really critical ways. How do you measure that? How do you measure, the cultivation of truthfulness or the cultivation of tolerance of the opposition or whatever? I don't know how to answer that question, but I just raise it as something critical that I think this is part of what, we ought to be struggling to figure out somehow in this project.
And if I can just add, I think this is why, at least for political scientists, kind of the normal variables aren't where we should be starting from, right? Our normal variables don't think about power, they don't think about values, and they most certainly don't think about white racial attitudes as meaningful to democracy. And so that's, I think, why contextualizing people, both in terms of Harrie's point about organizations, but to Ethan's point, right? If we did a survey where we're asking those questions and we know that this is a person who spends their social media time in anti-democratic spaces, right? That's something you then use to interpret your attitudinal information. But I think appreciating that those tendencies are actually part and parcel of American democracy, and violence in the face of racial justice has always been part of our history. And so I think our surveys historically have been very decontextualized in that way. We treat people as sort of moving through space and as if the space is all the same. And so I think, in fact, building something that really takes those things seriously and how it moves through time, to Joe's point, right? How people grow up through it, what happens to you once you're in those kinds of spaces. I think that's what we need to know more about so that we really can be more nuanced in our understanding of how democracy works.
David, I really appreciate the provocation. I like the idea of drawing a distinction between civic and democratic. And I brought the word civic in not with a real agenda behind it. I've been running a center called the Center for Civic Media for 9 years. So it tends to be the broad term that I end up reaching for. Where I do want to push back though is I think I'm with you. QAnon is certainly not evidence of healthy democratic engagement. On the flip side, I sure as hell want to know what % of Americans believe some aspect of the QAnon theory and are engaging in civics, politics, public life in one fashion or another based on that knowledge and understanding. And simply knowing where it's represented within spaces and acknowledging that people who see themselves engaged in those discussions see themselves as taking civic action, that strikes me as enormously important. And right now, the ability of white nationalists to mobilize people, QAnon mobilizing people through a campaign like Save the Children, that to me feels like an incredibly important and novel part of our civic and political.
Wipe itself off.
Very open to the notion that it's deeply anti-democratic. But I think unless we take some steps to sort of understand, is this a big phenomenon? Is it a small phenomenon? And how do we engage people who literally mistrust our methods, our jobs, our whole existence? We were on the risk of having a deeply inaccurate portrait of what contemporary American democracy looks like.
I don't want to make this a one-on-one back and forth. I strongly agree with that and also need to get more milk for my daughter. So let me encourage somebody else to continue the conversation as I do so.
Should we see if anyone has any questions from our Brady Bunch audience?
Let's go get the milk cup.
Okay. Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, could I jump in? Yeah, this is great, guys. It's great to kind of hear all of these plans, and it's fantastic. I do agree that it seems like you guys have a huge agenda in front of you, and just kind of prioritizing, because it seems like you want to look at in a lot of different places, and it seems like it would be a very challenging, expansive kind of project to get underway. But so I had a couple of questions, though. I read the background that was posted, the general policy report. And I'm curious how the data gathering that you guys are envisioning would fit with the reform agenda with this organization. You know, is it, you know, there are lots of reforms being mentioned in that report. And is the data gathering meant to inform that, or is the idea to kind of track citizen reactions to the reform? So that's one thing. And a different question that comes to me is if you are sort of looking most closely at individual citizens, okay? Yeah, I wonder if it would be useful to look at elite level attitudes as well. So to the extent you can get data on lawmakers, party leaders, you know, other people, to look at kind of the elite level decision making and the attitudes that they bring to those decisions and how they might change over time. Because I think that's a big part when we think about the quality of representation. So those sort of two things, the social science bit and the policy reform bit, and then kind of to complement the citizen data gathering, maybe elite level inquiries as well.
I mean, I'll just jump in and say that on the relationship, I mean, again, like this is one of those things where I don't feel like I have any particular knowledge on this. I would invite others from the commission to jump in on this, but I don't know that we necessarily imagine that there would be such a direct relationship between the proposed reforms and this data gathering instrument itself. I think there could be some downstream ways in which we would pick up, if it were to happen, some data that would help assess the effectiveness of some of the other proposed reforms. But I think to me, the notion was that there is independent intrinsic value in doing this kind of data project that helps us understand an important phenomenon in civic life, and that is part of, you know, what would help us do the work of strengthening civic life over time. On the elite question, yeah, I would love to hear what other people think. Like, I don't think we have really talked about, at least in the conversations that I've been a part of, and I certainly haven't been a part of all of them, but I don't think we've really talked about that a lot, and so I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Thoughts, reactions?
I mean, I would just agree. It seems like a really important thing to do. I mean, so my reaction is yes. I mean, I think that's really important to keep in mind and to include somehow or to add.
So I'll speak to that. I would guess that if you went around and asked the people involved in this about having data on elected officials or however we would define more elite folks, I think everybody would agree, yeah, it's a great idea, we should do that. I think practically that is extraordinarily difficult to do. It might literally be impossible for members of Congress. You know, there was once a time when Dick Fenno could just go to hang out with members of Congress, but those days are gone. And now there are efforts to collect data from members, but what you really get are staffers filling out questionnaires for strategic purposes. So it's not clear that the data is useful. That wouldn't preclude, however, and this is maybe something to think about, might be possible to collect data on people in state legislatures. They might not be so professionalized that they would pass everything off to a staffer. And that might be at a particularly interesting group, because they're understudied, although forgive me, there might be somebody in the group who says, what do you mean, that's my dissertation, I've done that. But I don't think there's a big systematic effort to collect data from members of state legislatures or other similar elected officials that are not at the level of Congress per se.
Just a quick two-finger. Yeah, no, David, you're absolutely right. I think it would be, you know, probably impossible to expect the kind of survey compliance that you get with voters, you know, if you're surveying members of Congress or even state lawmakers maybe. But there might be other kind of non-survey based ways to get at, you know, like Twitter analyses, or, you know, the analysis of speech or travel decisions, where these elites are going, or the sort of recruitment in. And, you know, so there might be a lot of things outside of just survey data that might give some insights into the attitude dispositions of political elites across a range of ideological positions and so on, and what they're actually doing, and how that might relate then maybe to the individual, the sort of citizen level data that you all are, you know, going to be collecting. So it's just a thought. I was thinking, you know, when I think about the quality of representation, it seems like knowing some things about the representatives and the officials would be, you know, part of the piece.
I would toss in that brought to mind for me Susan Herbst's book, Reading Public Opinion, large because it's just one of my favorite books. But she studies sort of 3 points on the triangle, which is she studies political elites at the state legislature level, she studies activists as engaged citizens, and she studies media, she studies journalists. And one piece of civic health that we haven't talked about yet is the decline of media organizations, particularly local media, right? Like in much of the country is now news deserts, where your media is either national media / partisan media, or it is filtered through Facebook, mostly Facebook and a little bit of Twitter, because there is no longer a local news organization. There's some of the people who in the field of political communication have been studying Sinclair Broadcasting and their acquisition of local media, and when they do so, they basically nationalize it and pump in propaganda, or at the very least, news with a very clear perspective. And so if we want to study both civic engagement but also democratic health, speaking for the field of common journalism studies, Carrie and others have long said that you need a healthy media is required for a healthy democracy. That may be another thing to be tracking there. So along with the perspectives of elected officials and the perspectives of citizens and the organizations who mobilize them, also tracking the extent to which we still have news organizations and reporters, particularly at the local and state level. I feel like we're kind of in the brainstorming big projects that are for somebody else, which is one of the most fun things to do at a conference. So what other types of data would you like somebody else to get the money for and gather?
So here's a, oh, go ahead, Ethan.
Questions to the audience.
Oh, hi, can I ask a question? Yes, hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, my name is Sönke. I'm a researcher in Switzerland, so welcome from Switzerland. I mean, I'm just thinking, I mean, maybe, I don't know what your budget is or not, but have you ever considered doing RCTs, any randomized control trials, experiments to figure out what works and what doesn't? I understand some of I have just looked in the report, so I don't know the details, but of course, some of the proposals are institutional, so maybe that's difficult, but others deal like geometric preferences with behavior in digital domain or not. So that could be an open issue, whether to run experiments or not. Thanks.
So in the work that I'm doing on platforms, I'm finding that people are really trying to answer 3 different types of questions. There's sort of the hope of answering broad social science questions. Are we getting more polarized? Are we coming apart as a populace? How do the opinions of my friends affect my voting behavior? That's one sort of class of questions. Incredibly important, might well need massive platform data from it. A second is, what are these platforms doing to us as individuals and as citizens? And those are really hard to study with data from the platforms because it's inherently critical. So you almost have to study that in an adversarial fashion. There's starting to be some researchers who are doing RCTs, who are also doing causal inference experiments. And these have a lot to do with democratic engagement on platforms. So if Twitter decides to start marking Trump's tweets as misleading or potentially vote suppressing, how does that change people's behavior? How does that change their behavior on the platform and off the platform? That's research that sometimes you can carry out, particularly in cooperation with those platforms. So Nate Matias over at Cornell University has a lab which is doing work around those experiments on Wikipedia and on Reddit, which are 2 communities where it's a whole lot easier to work with the platforms than it is necessarily to work with Facebook or Twitter. So I think RCTs, I think other methods of doing this, like causal inference, can get you some really strong data, particularly in domains like online engagement. As far as doing RCTs, as far as real world intervention, really far from my field and very hard for me to even talk about sort of the costs associated with it.
Yeah, thanks.
I know you've done some RCTs.
I mean, I think I would echo what Ethan said, just to sort of, even outside of the kind of digital public square questions, like I think we'd be, that like they're, I would imagine that, one of the principles that animates the study, and Dave Campbell, you should correct me, but if I'm wrong, but is that it's an open source, it's an open data platform, so that the data would be publicly available, and that it would, there'd be some way in which scholars from around the world could contribute questions and ideas and things that they would want to have studied. And so in that way, it's hopefully an impetus to create a shared learning community around sets of questions that not only whoever the kind of panel or group is that's putting together the core survey instrument, but would allow for other kinds of studies as well. So, but I also just want to underscore one thing that Ethan said, which I think is right, which is I feel like sometimes we're so trained to think of like RCTs as the only way to think about causal inference. And I feel like, especially as we think about some of the kind of big data and the opportunities that are out there, there's just so many other tools that we have available up to us to be able to tease out counterfactuals and think very carefully about the relationships to things, and especially in situations where the relationships are not always linear, where X doesn't always lead to Y, but sometimes there's a cyclical or nonlinear relationship therein, and that having layered data that allows for more complicated investigations, I think opens up the range of tools that we have available to us.
Can I just also remind everyone that there are actually kind of, I think, two different things floating around in the conversation. One is one piece of the Commission's recommendations, which is the Democratic Engagement Project, which could, I suppose, include some sort of experimental component. But then there's also the wider Commission, which has many, many other recommendations, some of which might actually be prone or more likely to be researchable, if you will, through an RCT, at least on a small scale. And I think I took your question as being more about the latter, that there are a bunch of recommendations that have come out of the Commission, some of which might be subject to experimentation, which would not necessarily be part of this data project, although it could be, but the data project wouldn't be necessarily like a program evaluation of something in particular, particular intervention. It would be just sort of this general monitoring that's going on. But you could imagine targeting something and saying, well, what happens if we do ranked choice voting? Let's try it out. Let's see if we can't subject that to an RCT.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, but I've been just thinking out loud, right? I mean, I'm just listening. I've never heard of your commission. I am actually working on a similar project with Common Purpose in the UK. But we are also kind of like looking for different options, how to work on it. But yeah, and I like these ideas, and I like also the combination. If you think about combining digital and something on the ground, I mean, you can target localities, right? You can see whether you have digital tools, you can target individuals, but you can try to do something on a local level. But yeah, I mean, basically this answers more or less my questions. Thanks.
Other questions from the audience?
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm Nicole Gallant. I'm from Canada. I wanted to get back to some of the topics that need to be addressed, like we were invited to contribute to that thinking. And something that Ethan said earlier strikes me as crucial, which is how do we measure the not so classic forms of political participation or civic engagement or whatever the conceptual tool we use. These new forms are very hard to grasp in survey measures instead of perhaps qualitative work. And in terms of working on that, I will get back in touch with some of you. I'm trying to put together a panel to think about that at the British PSA, the Political Studies Association, within the youth, like the Young People in Politics group, trying to put together people who are doing more political sociology with qualitative methods and others who are trying to find like metric measures of that could be used in a survey. So I think it would be absolutely crucial to get these people in touch with you and trying to conceive of what kind of tools we can use to grasp these new forms that are very diverse and so very difficult to ask with very few questions. So, hoping, I'm seeing some nodding, so I'll be getting in touch.
Joe, maybe you want to reflect on sort of some of the work that YPP did on sort of thinking about other forms of political engagement and watching them emerge. How did you and Kathy sort of understand that in starting to build survey instruments behind it?
Oh, well, thanks, Ethan. No, I'm happy to say a little bit. I think this conversation is, you know, as people have said, it resonates because as we are all observing politics broadly, we're just recognizing the limits of a lot of assumptions that have driven sort of traditional framing of what we should care about and, you know, what's good. Even as I think David was raising earlier in the exchange, Ethan, with you, I think this question about maybe a distinction between the quantity of engagement in a variety of ways and the qualities of engagement. And I do think there are a lot of ways in which we can ask about the qualities of engagement, but once we start getting very normative like that, it's really, you know, are you respectful to other people is, you know, really not a question that you want to ask in that way. And so what I like about the vision that I think you were championing, Ethan, of figuring out how we could integrate data about how people actually behave in a variety of settings. And the online is obviously an exciting one to look at, because at least if you could get over the fact that companies like Facebook own it, it is all there on some level, right? I mean, the data do exist. So that's an exciting possibility about being able to look at what people actually do and be able to code it and then make sense of it. I think in our work, you know, we certainly didn't have the capacity to do that in a full sense, but tried to get innovative in terms of just broadening what you ask about. So for example, one of the things that Kathy Cohen added to the survey that I think ended up being very interesting, you know, there's a number of questions about political knowledge that are very common that, you know, we're well aware of, that people have used, and we know a lot about their properties. But she asked for, you know, what the equivalent would be of, do you know who, you know, Eric Garner was, right? And I mean, you could imagine this for any number of things. And what you find, right, is different groups of people have different kinds of knowledge depending what you ask about. And so if you begin to take seriously the significance, for example, of these broader domains of politics, say in this case, stuff around police violence, you would create a whole new set of items that you might care about that you might not care about if questions of police violence aren't part of your, you know, standard framework for how you're thinking about politics. I think similarly, we asked a bunch of questions about engagement in online participatory communities that, again, as I think Ethan was saying, many people wouldn't consider civic, but we wanted to consider them as civic, and we wanted to see how they related to other forms of civic and political life. So for example, you know, yeah, have you, you know, are you a member of, one could ask, online communities, but you could also just name communities. Do you do this? How often are you in spaces where you do that? I think those begin moving us towards the kind of possibilities, but I don't think they go anywhere near as far as we need to go, which really would require, you know, could we sort of splice in data about what people actually do online so that we could relate it to these broader phenomena.
Got a little over 15 minutes left. If oh, Margaret Post, I see as their hand raised. So Margaret Post.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this terrific conversation. I'm delighted to be able to learn more about the work you've been doing. I'm wondering if Hahrie and Lisa, you might be able to talk a little bit more about what you hope to capture in this notion of situating people in the context of political space. For just some context from where I come from on these questions, I've been working for the last 24 months with Elizabeth Boris at the Urban Institute to try to understand the increasing role that C4 nonprofit advocacy organizations are playing. We're working with a sort of unwieldy data set of 4,500 organizations. And so we're, particularly interested in this question of how do we understand the space that this particular type of organization occupies in the civic infrastructure, knowing that it's just one piece of the puzzle of understanding civic infrastructure. So I'd love to hear more about how you're thinking about that question and where the work that we're doing might contribute to understanding those relationships of how people find pathways to participating in democracy as we're looking at organizations that are increasingly trying to offer up opportunities for individuals to participate in partisan activities.
Do you want to start, Hahrie, or do you want me to? Maybe I'll try to be quick and just say, Joe, I think could also maybe speak to the role of schools in this. I think in general, we have under-theorized how political opportunity structures affect people's engagement and how those opportunity structures, even within the same geographic space, vary significantly by class, by race, by gender, what kinds of schools you can attend, how many opportunities you have to join organizations, the degree to which you're recruited, right? And so I think it's a real opportunity to more meaningfully understand how kind of where you happen to live really affects what political opportunities are offered to you over the course of your lifetime, and how that affects political knowledge, how that affects senses of efficacy, your sense of power. And so I would say, and then there's the other layer, I think we know nothing about how partisan activities vary from nonpartisan, right? Because often it's firewalled and you can't study both, or, in general, I think that's a really interesting layer of the question in terms of what the stakes are. So I think I think we know very little. And so I would just want us to know more and to really think about those different types of organizations, opportunities, protest activity, movement activity, all the things that happen on the ground that Hahrie is an expert in as well.
So, I would agree with everything that Lisa said, and Margaret, it's lovely to see you, and thank you for coming to our panel and being part of our audience. So Margaret and I should just say, so Margaret and I have actually talked about some of this work that we're doing, but I think I've had various conversations with different people on the panel, but not everyone on the panel, about pieces of the work that we've been doing to kind of map the organizational space a little bit. And by we here, I'm referring to my institute at Johns Hopkins, which is called the SNF Agora Institute. And so, we did something very similar to what Margaret and Elizabeth did. We just basically took the database of 501c3 and, basically nonprofit organizations, and you get a ton of information if you download that, because then you have a map of all these sort of C3 and C4 organizations across the registered C3 and C4 organizations across the United States. You have addresses where you can geolocate at least where their headquarters are. You have mission statements, you have data on expenditures and revenue, and all this kind of stuff. And we hired this guy who, I'm giving a little bit of a longer story, partly because we have time and partly because I think it's kind of interesting, who actually did his PhD at MIT in the 90s in biology. And he was, in grad school at the time when genomics and proteomics and all these omics fields were being born, where it's they were realizing in biology, if we map the human genome, then there's all of a sudden all these questions that we could ask that we never even thought we could ask before. And that sort of opened up a whole new lines of inquiry that have since been developed in different ways. And this guy, did his PhD, but then went on and worked in political data. He didn't go into an academic career, but worked sort of in data analytics and in the political world. And so, anyway, so he's just kind of doing this. So the way that he's been talking about this project, which has been kind of fun, is is there a civic omics? Can we sort of map the civic world in a way that begins to sort of open up this possibility to ask and answer questions? So it's if I could say in a community, here's where museums and libraries and civic organizations and all these other kinds of things are there, and I can layer that on top of data that gives me a sense of what people's like affective and behavioral sort of life looks like, and the multitudinal ways in which they engage that are capital P political and not, then what can we learn, And so there are, and so I think that, and then, obviously like one big question of this is how would people's digital lives kind of layer onto that? And, it's all like, it's all very notional right now. So I'm just like kind of, sort of, and so Margaret, to answer your question is like, I would kind of see the work that you and Elizabeth are doing, like I said, like, I think we're very much hoping that this will be a kind of like open sourced project where different people could plug into different pieces of it in a variety of different ways. And so if there's a centralized survey instrument, that's layered onto like other kinds of things, and we haven't even talked about the ability, and this is one of the things that we've been thinking about, to layer like organizational data onto survey data is kind of like one level, but then there's also so much other data that's available. What if we were able to get pieces of human movement data? What if we're able to get, we can just like scrape off the web, like all sorts of information about these organizations. Like my big dream, which, I think Lisa would share, maybe, I don't know, is to like be able to like come up with some way of like scraping data that would tell us like what's a real constituency-based organization from an organization that claims members but doesn't actually have a real constituency, and like right now we don't have this ability to sort of say what's the difference from an empirical standpoint unless you really dive into the guts of the organization, from like the engagement that you get through an AARP versus the engagement that you get through a Color of Change versus the engagement that you would get through a faith-based community organizing group or something like that, And so is there data available that would help us answer some of these kinds of questions? Like, I would love to be able to do that, but I don't know, So right now we're to the very beginning stages of like, is there a kind of bare bones version of civicomics, that could be created? And then, my hope very much would be that our common purpose data, or this democratic engagement project, that this is able to kind of become a part of it. And Margaret, the work that you and Elizabeth would do would obviously give us a lot more texture onto some of the C4 data that otherwise doesn't exist.
Hey, it's Elizabeth. Can I have a word?
Oh, Elizabeth, I'm so glad you're here.
I am. Fascinating discussion. I just want to do a footnote for Harry's conversation here. I'm working with a group that's got a National Science Foundation grant, and we're trying to put together a panel study of nonprofit organizations that would be surveyed over time and linked to this 990 data and be open source for scholars. So I hope you keep that in mind, because I think there are ways that we can be linking up and thinking about questions that we want to be asking as we go on in the future. So we're already working on our first survey, and it's of, as you might expect, giving and volunteering and COVID kinds of things, but we expect to get into lots of other issues as we go along. So I'm hoping that there are some ways where we can intersect.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'll just add, oh, sorry, if someone else has a question. I was going to actually ask a question to Marie, but Jay, you should jump in.
Oh, well, I was just going to jump in. Guys, this is fantastic. I love all the creativity here. One question that I have is about the longitudinal thinking. Most data sets, sample during election cycles, but it sounds like you would want to do some different things if you want to think about participation broadly, outside of a campaign context. I'm wondering what you're thinking just about the longitudinal components. How would you cut up time in your surveys to look at engagement? Or what are you thinking about that?
Maybe I can speak to that, or at least the way I envision this. So we have to think practically, and if this were to be funded, I don't think it would be realistic to try to pitch this as an election-based study. In fact, I think most people involved would probably prefer that it not be centered on an election. But I can't imagine going to a program officer and saying, well, that national election study that gets done every year, and that cooperative congressional election study that gets done every year. Well, we want to do something like that at the same time, and nobody's going to be interested. But if if we could pitch the study as being quite distinct from what already exists, because it would look at non-electoral forms of participation and would not be tied to the electoral cycle, I think that would actually be an important selling point of it, both in terms of getting it funded, but also in terms of what we would learn from it. In terms of its frequency, again, there's some ambiguity here, and in the thing I wrote, I left it deliberately ambiguous. So the term longitudinal can be used in two different ways. It can just simply mean a repeated cross-section, so like what we think of as the NES or the time series component of the NES, or it could mean literally longitudinal in that you're interviewing the same people over time. Now, we probably all prefer to do the latter, interviewing the same people over time on a panel. That is extraordinarily expensive and difficult to do. But if it were possible, or even if some component of the study had a longitudinal piece to it, so maybe not the whole thing, like you're refreshing the cross-section every year or every 2 years, but along the way you're adding in a panel component, that would be a very, very powerful design. But a lot of that depends on, again, how much money we can raise and how large a team you can assemble.
Yeah, I like the idea of surveying outside of the election context. That would be a real contribution.
So I want to know, we have 8 minutes left, so I think we have time for sort of final thoughts from any panelists who want to offer them. But not everyone at once, folks.
I have to jump a few minutes before we're done. I just want to say thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks to all the fellow panelists. And you guys are all brilliant, and I just enjoy listening to you.
David, we're also open to questions from your 4-year-old.
I think she mostly wants to know things about Daniel Tiger. We've only seen the first 3 seasons, so if there's any spoilers people want to offer that I can make use of.
Hahrie has made the case that we need to layer multiple layers of data onto our understanding of democratic citizenship. I think Wikipedia articles about Daniel Tiger might be helpful.
Although I would say anecdotally, just for my own children, now that they have to listen to my calls, they've decided that politics is the most boring thing ever. So we maybe want to be careful about how we socialize.
My kids have had the same reaction. They're like, seriously, this is what you do all day?
So my twist on that is my kids are a little older. They're in their 20s, but when the pandemic started, we were all together at home because they had to come back. And I was teaching from home, and I was teaching at 9:30 in the morning, which it turns out was kind of early for these folks. And I didn't realize how loud I was because I was speaking in my office, and apparently I was reverberating throughout the entire house. So they all got to hear my lectures. And that was the same reaction. Wow, that's really what you do all day, Dad? Really?
Hey, if we're wrapping up here, I have a question for you guys. And David, you've mentioned this several times, funding. So how's this going to happen? I mean, who funds it? What are the big ideas for fundraising here? I haven't been a part of those conversations, so I'm really curious what your thoughts are.
I mean, I think my understanding is that the co-chairs are working right now to sort of organize groups of people to kind of do implementation on all the different kind of things. And around this, like part of it is to try to figure out what are the pieces that need to be put into place in order to be able to go out. And I think initially the idea is like philanthropic dollars, maybe, just to kickstart it, and then figure out what the long-term funding mechanism is. So.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that it would have to be either one or multiple private foundations. It seems very unlikely that public dollars would be the way to fund this. And I don't actually think that'd be a good idea anyway. It'd be too tenuous. Even if the NSF did come up with some money, you'd be fighting for it every year. It'd be the NES all over again, and that's not healthy.
I would interject that in the same way that after the election 4 years ago, there was a big burst of interest in democratic decline. We don't know what the foundation space is, philanthropic space is going to be excited about in January, but there's a real possibility that it's going to get very excited about democratic renewal and sort of what are the necessary components of democratic renewal and how do you get there. So I imagine those pitches are going to be on hold in the months of September and October anyway. And then they'll probably get framed around whatever the world's looking like a few months from now, because it'll be different. I just don't know how.
Well, I heard the virus is just going to disappear on the day after the election, so that'll be a mark in its favor.
That'd be great.
Too, actually.
That'd be great. All right, let me let's call it here. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the audience. Again, weirdest APSA ever, and I'm hoping that we are actually establishing this as the weirdest one that there will ever be. I'm hoping that future APSAs will be a breathtaking return to normalcy. But this has been a great group of scholars talking about some of the most important questions that we in political science grapple with. And hopefully what we've been talking about here today helps to set the path forward for research for years to come. So thank you everybody. It's been great talking with you all.
Bye-bye, folks.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Nice to see you.